They said the Whitmore mansion was silent after dusk, but the silence was not empty. Neighbors described it as thick, almost tangible, as if the very walls refused to breathe. And if you walked close enough, some swore you could hear a faint tapping, irregular, like fingers on wood, though no hand had ever been seen through those windows since 1812. The official histories of rural New York in the early 19th century make no mention of Eleanor Whitmore. She does not appear in census rolls, not in family registries, not even in the faded town ledgers that account for every birth, marriage, and death. And yet, fragments survive. A line in a priest's diary, a torn deposition in a courthouse attic, a redacted page from an asylum record, its ink washed with water as if someone tried to drown the truth. These pieces, scattered and nearly erased, whisper of a girl who was forced into silence, and who eventually used silence as her weapon. Her story begins not with her, but with the man she was bound to, Jonathan Whitmore. A merchant's son who traded in timber, then land, then human contracts. He was twice Eleanor's age, nearly 40 when she was barely 12. The marriage, arranged by her impoverished father, was transacted in a backroom handshake, not a church. A girl traded for the survival of her family line. No one asked Eleanor what she thought. No one ever did. Neighbors remembered seeing her on that first day, carried into the Whitmore house like cargo. A child with ribbon braids and eyes so wide they looked bruised. She never returned to the village square again. But here's where the file begins to decay, where what survives feels more like testimony smuggled out than any proper record. One local, identified only as CR, wrote in the margins of an 1813 land dispute, "The Whitmore girl sings no more. She walks the halls by night. He has sealed her voice away." The phrase repeats in other fragments. Sealed her voice. But what does it mean? A metaphor for domination? Or something more literal, more physical? Every mention is stricken through in ink as if someone tried to erase the very idea. And yet, those who lived near the Whitmore estate claim they sometimes heard humming drifting through the trees late at night, high-pitched, uneven, always cut off mid-note. What happens to a child when every breath of hers is owned? When her very silence becomes a prison built by another man's hand? Jonathan Whitmore was no drunkard, no public brute. He was methodical, meticulous, a man who kept ledgers on every tenant and servant, down to the halfpenny. In his journals, what little survive, we see the same method applied to his wife. Lines of observation like she was an investment. Eleanor shows signs of stubbornness, correction required. Withholding speech until compliance. Another, night terrors increased. Will not eat unless watched. And finally, the most chilling, experiment with isolation successful. 6 days without utterance. What was an experiment to Jonathan was torment to Eleanor. The Whitmore estate, vast and windowless in its upper wings, was said to have rooms built without doors. Spaces bricked, sealed, left hollow as if the house itself was a labyrinth of captivity. Was she placed there? Forced to endure silence until her mind splintered? We do not know. The records crumble. The testimonies contradict. But then, in the winter of 1812, Jonathan Whitmore vanished. The official line: he drowned during a trading expedition along the Hudson. His boat capsized. No body was ever recovered. But when the estate was searched weeks later, his personal study had been stripped of ledgers, maps, contracts, everything but one torn sheet. On it, in Eleanor's handwriting, were the words, "You taught me silence. Now it is yours forever." The handwriting matches other samples from her later asylum records. There is no dispute. She left the note plain as day. And yet, no charges were filed, no trial ever held. His death was ruled accidental. Eleanor inherited the mansion. And from that moment, no one saw her again. Only the house remained, shuttered, guarded by silence. Farmers claimed they saw candles lit at odd hours, a figure moving behind gauze curtains. But no servant entered. No guest departed. She lived entombed in her inheritance, in the very silence that had once imprisoned her. And here the story should end. A tragic child bride, briefly a widow, fading into obscurity. But the archive does not let us go so easily. Because 30 years later, when the Whitmore mansion was finally auctioned, the buyers discovered something that rattled even hardened men of commerce. Behind one of the walled-up chambers on the 3rd floor, sealed so carefully it seemed part of the structure, they found a chair. Heavy, bolted to the ground. And on it, restraints, leather eaten by time. Nearby, a ledger half-burned, containing only dates. No names. Just dates, marked with neat lines, each ending with the word complete. Local legend insists those were Jonathan's records of Eleanor's confinement. But others, whispering in taverns, told a darker story, that after his disappearance, Eleanor used the room herself. That she became the warden, not the prisoner. That silence, once her torment, became her instrument of revenge. A letter, and signed, surfaced in the 1840s, tucked into a Bible found at the property. It reads, "She does not kill. She teaches silence. Hours, days, weeks. The house listens, and when the silence breaks, so do they. I hear the tapping still. We cannot verify this. But if true, it suggests Eleanor Whitmore transformed the architecture of her suffering into a mechanism of punishment. Not just against her husband, but against others who crossed her path. Who those others were, the record will not say. The names are gone. But the dates, there were more than 20. Pause for a moment and consider the psychology. When someone is stripped of voice, of agency, of recognition, what tools are left to them? Silence is not just absence of sound. It is suffocation. It eats the mind from within, deprives the body of the tiny affirmations that say, "You exist. You are heard." For Eleanor, silence was once a tomb. To repurpose it as an instrument of control suggests not madness, but precision. A method born of trauma. And if the town suspected? If whispers circulated of missing peddlers, vanishing vagrants, servants who left without farewell, why then was nothing said? Why no trial, no inquiry? Perhaps because silence suited them too. In a society built on transactions of power, on arranged contracts and traded daughters, perhaps Eleanor was simply playing by their rules, but with a cruelty they dared not name. By the time the estate was sold, the house had already taken on its own mythology. Children dared each other to press their ears against the walls. Some came back crying, claiming they'd heard breathing. Others swore they heard Eleanor's humming, cut off, always mid-note. The buyer at auction, a man from Albany, attempted to renovate. He lasted 6 months before abandoning the property. His testimony, preserved in a court claim for damages, contains one line that chills: "It is not empty. The house does not forgive sound." We may never know how Jonathan Whitmore died. We may never know what Eleanor did, or whom she silenced in return. The fragments will not give us the comfort of certainty. But the unease remains, heavy as the hush inside those walled rooms. And so I ask you, when you consider Eleanor Whitmore, do you see a victim who reclaimed her power, or a child forced to learn cruelty from the only language she was given? Silence as inheritance. Silence as revenge. Silence as contagion. If you've followed me this far, write in the comments, "The silence watches." Let's see how many of you are still listening, still willing to stare into the void history tried to erase. And if you wish to join our society of truth seekers, subscribe, not to a channel, but to a covenant. Here we open what should never have been opened so that silence cannot win. But the story of Eleanor Whitmore is not finished. Because in the deepest archive, in the asylum files dated 1847, there lies one final note. A doctor's handwriting, weary and scrawled, as if afraid of the very words he put to paper. The widow does not speak. But when the ward is quiet, she smiles. The doctor's note, dated 1847, is the last official record of Eleanor Whitmore. But unofficially, quietly in whispers in diaries tucked into trunks and letters never mailed, her shadow continues to spread across the decades. Think of the silence that surrounded her. No census entry, no gravestone, no obituary. It's as though every trace of her life had been carefully scrubbed away. And yet, why do we still find fragments, ink-stained, half-burned, hidden in the seams of forgotten archives? Was it chance? Or was someone leaving breadcrumbs, knowing that someday someone would go looking? One fragment comes from the asylum's maintenance log. The line is buried in lists of repairs, but it is there: Patient Whitmore, room reinforced. Sound carries too easily. Staff complain of humming. It's not the humming itself that disturbs, it's the fact that even in her confinement, decades after Jonathan's disappearance, she was still making the same sound villagers reported in 1812, a tune that ends abruptly as if cut short by a hand unseen. We might dismiss this as coincidence, a tic of the traumatized mind. But what unsettles is not the sound itself, it is the effect it had. Orderlies refused her ward duty. Doctors rotated quickly, citing interference with sleep. Patients who shared the wing reported auditory disturbances. Knocking, tapping, whispered words that never resolved into speech. How could one woman, frail, middle-aged, institutionalized, command such dread? The answer may lie in what silence becomes when it is cultivated, tended like a weapon. Eleanor learned it first as a prisoner. Days, perhaps weeks, of being sealed away by Jonathan. We imagine her lying in a chair bolted to the floor, her voice strangled by the absence of ears to hear it. In such deprivation, the mind grows sharp in strange ways. It begins to measure the world differently, not in words but in pauses, absences, gaps. By the time she emerged, if she ever did, Eleanor had become fluent in silence the way others are fluent in language. And perhaps she discovered something. Silence could bend people, make them tremble, unravel their sanity without ever laying a hand on them. There are accounts from attendants, though the handwriting often trails into smudges, as if the writer thought better of confessing too much. One describes entering Eleanor's room to find her sitting perfectly still, facing the wall. She would not turn when spoken to, would not blink, would not breathe loudly enough to hear. After minutes passed, the attendant would feel a pressure in the chest, as though he himself had been muted. Then, without warning, Eleanor would hum a single note, barely audible, and stop. The attendant ran, he admitted, because I felt the silence would take me too. Is this madness or mastery? Was she simply a broken mind, lost in patterns of trauma? Or did she discover a psychological lever, something we have no language to describe? We might laugh at the idea, until we remember the sealed room in the Whitmore mansion. The restraints, the ledger of dates marked complete. If that was not Jonathan's doing, then whose? Could Eleanor, even after her husband's disappearance, have lured others into her quiet chambers? And if so, what became of them? In 1851, 4 years after the doctor's note, Eleanor's name disappears from the asylum ledger. The page is blank. Not crossed out, not overwritten, blank as if removed with care. No burial record exists. No transfer order. It is as though she simply stopped existing. Yet the Whitmore mansion, abandoned after the failed renovation, did not stay silent. Stories spread. A schoolteacher in 1863 noted in his diary that children were forbidden to play near it, though some still dared. They returned pale, shaken, unable, or unwilling, to describe what they heard inside. Soldiers quartered near the property during the Civil War left reports of insomnia and disorientation. One in a letter home wrote, "There is a house here where silence grows too loud. We post guards at night but they fall asleep standing, eyes wide open." It is tempting to dismiss all this as folklore. Rural communities cling to ghost stories. Silence is just absence, nothing more. But then there is the matter of the locked trunk. In 1879, when the estate was finally sold for scrap, laborers found a trunk in the basement, sealed with iron clasps. Inside, a collection of small personal effects. A ribbon, a locket with no photograph, a leather strap stiff with age. And beneath them, a notebook. The cover had rotted, the pages stained with mold, but the handwriting, Eleanor's, confirmed by analysts, was legible in parts. It was not a diary. It was a list. 23 names. Some crossed out, others left bare. None correspond to known residents of the county. Some are marked only with initials. But after the final entry, one phrase appears, underlined 3 times. They will learn the silence. How do we interpret this? Victims? Visitors? Inmates? Or were these simply phantoms of Eleanor's mind, catalogued in her loneliness? Skeptics argue she was hallucinating, projecting her torment onto imagined others. But if that is true, why do several of the initials match records of missing persons reported across upstate New York between 1813 and 1838? Coincidence? Or was Eleanor's silence not confined to her husband? We have only fragments, and fragments refuse to resolve into certainty. But perhaps certainty is not the point. Perhaps Eleanor's story was never meant to end with neat answers. Perhaps it was meant to fester, unfinished, like the hum that cuts off mid-note. Consider the psychology again. Silence as both prison and weapon. Survivors of solitary confinement often describe auditory hallucinations, the brain filling emptiness with phantom noise. But Eleanor seemed to reverse this, projecting silence outward, making others feel what had once unmade her. Trauma transmuted into contagion. And maybe this is why her story still clings to us, why it resurfaces in scattered archives despite attempts to erase it. Because silence, once planted, does not die. It waits. So let me ask you, what would you have done in her place? At 12, stripped of your childhood, sealed into walls where sound itself was punished? Would you have forgiven when your captor disappeared? Or would you have built a sanctuary of silence not just for yourself, but for anyone who dared to trespass? If you're still here, still listening, write in the comments. The door is open. Because in Eleanor's house, silence was not just absence, it was invitation. And if you haven't yet joined us, subscribe. Not just for stories, but for entry into the archives, the files that history tried to bury but which still breathe. Here we gather the fragments and reconstruct what others fear to know. But before we close, one last document. Found in 1902, in a box of asylum papers marked for destruction. A letter, and signed, undated, tucked between medical invoices. It reads, "She is not gone. She has only passed into the walls. The staff cannot speak of it, but they feel it. When the ward is quiet, too quiet, she listens. And when you hear the humming, it is already too late." Eleanor Whitmore, the child bride, the widow, the silence that would not die. By the turn of the 20th century, the Whitmore mansion was nothing more than a husk, its roof sagging, shutters hanging loose, ivy choking its windows. Yet despite its decay, locals still refused to cross its threshold. They said the house had a pulse, that it inhaled the night air and exhaled something colder. When storms rolled across the valley, thunder seemed to stall above it, as if sound itself hesitated to touch those walls. In 1911, a group of amateur historians from Albany decided to test the legend. They were young men with money, skeptics by temperament, who believed the tales of Eleanor were nothing but superstition. They gained permission from the landowner to conduct a survey, documenting the house room by room. Their notes survive only because one of them, Henry Pike, sent letters to his sister describing the expedition. What began as playful curiosity soon turned into something far more unsettling. On the first night, Pike described the dust and mildew, the scurrying of mice through the rotted floorboards. But he also noted something peculiar. When the group spoke, their voices did not carry. It was as though the words dissolved, he wrote, absorbed by the walls? We shouted, and yet the echoes came back to us muffled as though someone else were swallowing the sound. On the second night, the men began to hear what the villagers had spoken of for nearly a century. A faint humming, not mechanical, not natural. Human. But always brief, always cut short like a song interrupted. One of the men joked nervously that Eleanor was still rehearsing the lullabies she never finished as a child. By the third night, laughter had stopped. The men reported sleeplessness, pressure in the chest, the sensation of being listened to by the house itself. One, Thomas Reeve, scratched in his notebook, "The silence is not absence. It presses against you. It waits for you to slip." Pike's final letter home is dated April 17, 1911. In it, he confesses something the newspapers never printed, that one of their party had disappeared. No trace, no sound. A bedroll still neatly folded, boots still by the door. But the man, David Lang, was never seen again. The expedition ended that morning. The group scattered. The official report omits any mention of Lang, writing only, "Survey concluded early due to unsafe conditions." Lang's name was never added to Eleanor's supposed list of 23. But some believe he belongs there nonetheless, absorbed into the unfinished ledger. What unsettles us is not just the possibility that Eleanor, or whatever she became, claimed another victim. It is the pattern, silence consuming those who sought to expose it. Archivists who burned pages, doctors who left lines blank, neighbors who refused to testify. Even skeptics who entered the house could not resist the pull of its hush. Silence was not just Eleanor's revenge. It was her legacy. Psychologists who study the case today, if they dare speak of it, interpret her story as an extreme example of learned silence. A trauma response in which the victim internalizes their own suppression until it becomes the only form of expression they know. But if that's all it was, why does it linger in the house? Why does it echo through letters and journals a century later? This is where Eleanor slips from history into something else. Something that feels more like contagion than biography. Silence as an inheritance, passed from body to building, from memory to myth. In 1932, the mansion burned. The official story: lightning struck the roof, setting the dry timbers ablaze. By morning, only the foundation remained. Yet firemen who fought the blaze told a different story in taverns and private conversations. They said the fire made no noise. No crackling wood, no shattering glass. Only when the beams collapsed did they hear the roar. Until then, it had been like watching a silent film. One fireman years later swore he heard humming beneath the flames. You could dismiss all this as exaggeration, if not for what was found in the ash. A single chair, iron-bolted, nearly untouched by fire. And in its seat, fused to the leather straps, a lock of hair. Dark, brittle with age. Tested in the 1970s, the sample was confirmed human. Female. No one claimed it belonged to Eleanor. By then, too much time had passed. But those who knew the story whispered, the house had given back only what it wished to. And here lies the most troubling part. Because even after the mansion's destruction, silence did not leave the valley. Travelers on the old Whitmore Road report the same sensation. Words dying in their throats, the air too still, too heavy. Children still dare each other to wait in the fields at night, listening for the faint hum that cuts short. It is as though Eleanor herself has dissolved into the landscape, carried on the hush between winds. Her revenge no longer confined to walls, but alive in the very absence of sound that cloaks the ruins. And if that is true, then her story has no end. Because silence, once planted, needs no keeper. It keeps itself. So let me turn the question back to you. When does a victim become something else? At what point does reclaiming power tip into perpetuating the same cruelty? If Eleanor was a prisoner who became warden, does that make her monster, or mirror? If you've made it this far, write in the comments, the silence survives. Let's mark ourselves not as passive listeners, but as witnesses who refuse to look away. And if you haven't yet joined our circle of truth seekers, subscribe now. Here we do not chase cheap frights. We exhume what was buried, we reconstruct what was erased. We give voice to what history wanted to keep silent. But Eleanor's story leaves us with one last fragment, recovered in 1954 from a private collection in Massachusetts. A priest's journal, water-stained, fragile, nearly lost to mildew. On the final page, one line is written in a trembling hand. They buried her name, but the silence found another body. Who that body was, we may never know. But if silence is contagion, if it leaps from person to person the way her story has survived centuries, then perhaps Eleanor Whitmore was never just one woman. Perhaps she was a beginning. And that should make you uneasy, because silence is patient. And right now, as you sit listening, it is here with us. History hides more than it reveals. Silence has a way of surviving longer than memory. It drifts from mouth to mouth, house to house, town to town, until no one recalls its origin, only its weight. Eleanor Whitmore's name may have been erased from ledgers, but the sensation she embodied, that remains. By the mid-20th century, her story had passed from whispered folklore into the hands of folklorists and amateur paranormal researchers. They treated it as a local curiosity, a rural myth, a ghost story with just enough archival debris to give it teeth. But every attempt to debunk Eleanor ended the same way, unfinished. Researchers abandoned projects mid-book, archivists stopped filing reports, interviews trailed off in ellipses. A 1968 university study into regional silence legends devoted nearly 60 pages to Eleanor before abruptly cutting off with the words, "Case study discontinued. Interference observed." What kind of interference silences academics in their own work? One clue emerges from a tape recording, discovered in 1981 in the basement of a closed psychiatric hospital in Utica. The reel-to-reel is damaged, warped by humidity, but portions are audible. A man, perhaps a researcher, speaks into the microphone, his tone shaky. Subject traces to Whitmore widow, 1812, recurring symptom. Enforced muteness, not organic, psychological contagion. Patient cease speaking after exposure to accounts. Then a pause. And faintly beneath the static, the same broken humming. The tape ends abruptly. This is where Eleanor's legacy becomes less about her as an individual and more about what she represents. The possibility that silence itself can spread like a sickness. If trauma is never voiced, never acknowledged, does it rot into something larger, something that seeps into the bones of a community? In Eleanor's case, the silence did not just remain within her. It multiplied, infecting witnesses, survivors, and storytellers alike. Even today, reports surface. Travelers along the ruins of the Whitmore property describe losing their voices for minutes at a time, unable to call out though their throats strain. Campers speak of dreams where a girl with braided hair hums but never finishes her song. And in digital spaces, those who study the story sometimes claim their recordings or drafts are corrupted. Sections vanishing, words cut mid-sentence, as though the silence had reached across time to censor them. We could dismiss this as coincidence. But then we remember the missing pages, the blank lines, the burned documents. Over 2 centuries of coincidences. Too consistent to ignore. So, who was Eleanor Whitmore really? A child bride traded as property, silenced by a husband who measured her suffering as if it were an experiment. A widow who inherited a house of walls and chambers and turned silence into her own form of power. A woman erased from the official record, yet more enduring than those who tried to bury her. Her body may have dissolved into time, but her silence lingers. And here is the most unsettling truth. Silence does not need Eleanor anymore. It has learned to live on its own. She may have been its catalyst, its vessel, but silence itself has become the air. And it asks only one thing of us, that we never speak of it too directly, never reduce it to simple explanation. Think about your own life. How many silences do you carry? Words you were never allowed to say? Memories that pressed against your throat but found no air? Multiply that by generations and you begin to understand why Eleanor's legend feels alive. It is not just her story. It is ours. If you've stayed with me through this descent, mark yourself in the comments with the phrase, "The silence remembers." Let's see who among us dares to claim witness to what history tried to erase. And if you have not yet joined our Society of Truth Seekers, subscribe, not for entertainment, but to step deeper into the forbidden archives. Here, every file we open is one more wound in the illusion that history is safe, tidy, finished. Because the truth is this, Eleanor Whitmore never ended. She is unfinished. Her silence has outlived her body, her house, her century. And tonight, as you close this video, pay attention to the space around you. The gaps between sounds. The moments when the air feels too still. That's where she waits. And if you hear humming, stop. Do not hum back. Do not try to finish the song. Because those who do are never heard from again. History hides more than it reveals.